I mentioned before that suppression of the virus had been a key element of the strategies pursued in Australia, New Zealand, and for that matter, in a number of the more advanced Asian economies, in contrast to the strategies that have been pursued with varying degrees of enthusiasm in the United States, Canada, and Europe. What I've shown on the left here is a measure of the strictness or stringency of restrictions imposed by governments in response to COVID-19 that's compiled by academics at the School of Government at Oxford University. This so-called stringency index has now been widely used to assess the severity and length of government's responses to COVID-19. And you can see that initially Australia's restrictions were on par with the weighted average of those for a broad selection of other advanced economies. And the chart also picks out more recently the intermittent lockdowns that we've now had in 4 of Australia. But on average, this chart suggests that Australia's restrictions have, since about October last year, been less severe than those of other advanced economies. And you can see from the right-hand chart that Australia has had fewer days with restrictions in excess of 70% on the Oxford Index than a majority of other advanced economies. But one aspect of this that's worth noting is that the measure of the stringency of Oxford restrictions compiled by Oxford doesn't comprehend border closures, which have been an important part of Australia's response to COVID-19 thus far. I want to make the point that Article 12 of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Australia is a signatory, which we ratified 40 years ago, says that everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own, and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. Apologies for the apparent sexism in that remark, but this treaty was written in the 1940s, and so I suppose should be seen in that context. Significantly, Australia is the only democracy in the world, according to the State Library of New South Wales, not to have enacted this convention into its domestic laws. Many other democracies, of course, have other provisions in their constitution, like the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, or in other conventions, such as the European Convention on Political Rights. Canada, likewise, has entrenched many of these civil liberties and rights into its constitution when they patriated it in 1982, and New Zealand has something similar. The Convention on Civil and Political Rights does have a couple of get-out clauses. Article 4 provides that in times of public emergency that threaten the life of the nation, parties to the convention can take measures that derogate from the obligations they sign up to, as mentioned under Article 12 and others. And Article 12 itself specifically mentions, among other things, a public health crisis as a reason for suspending people's rights to leave a country, although, at least as I read it, that exclusion doesn't apply to the right to enter or re-enter one's own country. What's interesting is that no other democracy appears to have availed itself of these get-out clauses to the extent that Australia has. In particular, there is no other democracy, though there are some other countries such as China, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, which have prevented their citizens from leaving their countries from extended periods. The Federal Court in Australia last month decided that the Biosecurity Act, which was enacted in, I think, 2015, overrode any rights of entry into Australia that the common law might otherwise have conferred on Australian citizens. This case came up following the Australian government's threat of up to 5 years jail for any Australian citizens who'd found themselves stranded in India and might have thought of returning to Australia via a third country. The Australian government has also threatened fines and jail to any Australian citizen who might be thinking about getting out to a third country via the travel bubble we have with New Zealand, which no other country, to my knowledge, has done. The Oxford University Index of the stringency of restrictions that I mentioned before doesn't include outward travel bans or restrictions on citizens returning to their own countries, because according to the guy who compiles these numbers, they assumed that countries would always let their own citizens return, and they wrote that into the training that they provided to their data collectors, telling them to focus only on restrictions that applied to non-citizens, which of course many countries, not just Australia, have done. Although Australia's travel bans have been highly unusual, they have nonetheless been extremely popular with voters. An opinion poll taken by Newspoll, who are a credible survey organisation and published in the Australian newspaper just after the budget in May last year, found that 73% of respondents agreed that international borders should remain largely closed until at least mid-2022. And that probably explains why the Prime Minister, who last year repeatedly said that Australians couldn't hide underneath the doona, in his words, describing the border closure indefinitely, is now one of the firmest proponents of keeping Australia's borders closed until at least mid-2022. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that date of mid-2022 is about a month after the last date on which the next federal election can be held, which is Saturday, the 20th of May, 2022. The most obvious consequence of Australia's border closure since March last year is that immigration has come to a standstill. We have had zero, in fact, slightly negative in the last 3 quarters net migration to Australia, with more people leaving, including, of course, foreigners who had been here but decided to and were allowed to return to their own countries. That's the lowest level of immigration Australia has had since 1942. And as a result of that, our population growth rate of 0.4% during 2020 was the slowest it has been since 1916, that is, in 104 years. One important consequence of this, which I'm going to dwell on in the next few minutes in this presentation, is that slower growth in the working age population, that is the population aged 15 and above, means that any given rate of employment growth results in faster reductions in the unemployment rate, all else being equal. Before I get to that, I just want to emphasise that the government's most recent budget was premised, as I've mentioned, on an assumption that the borders will remain effectively closed until the middle of 2022, and that after that they'll gradually reopen, probably initially to foreign students and to foreign tourists. But the government's assuming that by 2024-25, our immigration intake will have returned to pre-COVID levels of in excess of 200,000 people per year. But in the meantime, the ban on immigration to Australia, that is both permanent and temporary migrants, has had a profound impact on the way Australia's labour market is working. Over the decade to the onset of COVID, the working age population, that is people aged 15 or over, grew at an average monthly rate of about 26,000. That meant that, assuming an unchanged participation rate, that is the proportion of the working age population that's either employed or actively looking for work, assuming that's unchanged, the threshold for reducing the unemployment rate is new job creation averaging 16,500 a month. If you do better than that, you get a reduction in the unemployment rate. If you do worse than that, then you'd see an increase in the unemployment rate. Over the course of the decade to March 2020, the rate of new job creation fluctuated, but on average, it was in fact almost exactly 16,500 new jobs a month, which meant that the unemployment rate, although it did move around over the course of that decade from month to month and quarter to quarter, nonetheless began and ended with the unemployment rate at 5.25%. By contrast, since the onset of COVID, the working age population has grown by less than 5,000 a month because of the closure of our borders, which has meant on average over that period, anything more than 3,000 new jobs a month on average will result in a fall in the unemployment rate. Now, you can see from the end of that chart on the left that the rate of growth in the civilian working age population, which was initially negative, has picked up a bit to just under 10,000 a month in the first 2 months of the current quarter, the June quarter. If we project that forward, if we assume that over the course of the financial year that's about to start, the working age population grows at the same rate as it has done so far in the June quarter, that is by just under 10,000 a month. And again, we assume there's no change in the participation rate. All we need to keep the unemployment rate constant is jobs growth of just over 6,000 a month. Now, in fact, since January this year, employment has grown by an average of 51,000 a month. If we continued that pace through June next year, the unemployment rate would be less than 1% by June next year. I think it's unrealistic to assume we can sustain jobs growth at that pace, even though there are lots of vacancies around at the moment. Employers are reporting difficulty finding people with the required skills to fill them. If, for a more realistic assumption, employment grew at half the rate over the next 13 months that it has over the past 5, then by June next year, the unemployment rate would be down to 3.25%. That's well below the rate that the Reserve Bank and the Treasury now think is consistent with full employment. If employment growth was only 12,000 a month, which I think we will do fairly easily, then that would take us to 4.25% by June of next year, which is still consistent with Treasury's and the Reserve Bank's new view of how low the unemployment rate needs to be in order to generate the sort of wages growth that would in turn be consistent with consumer price inflation returning to the Reserve Bank's target of 2 to 3% per annum. Now, you might be saying, but that's only looking at the supply side of the labour market. What about the demand for jobs? What about the spending that migrants undertake when they come to Australia that helps create jobs, which indeed it does. But this brings me to the other dimension of Australia's border closures, which is the ban on people travelling overseas, unless, of course, they're sports people or cabinet ministers who can go overseas and chase up aspects of their family tree and then not have to quarantine in a hotel when they get home, but can do it in the lodge. Well, for the rest of us, the key point of the closure of the borders to outbound travel is that we've not been allowed to spend the roughly $55 billion a year that we would have spent overseas, based on recent trends, if we'd been allowed to. Everybody's well aware of the loss of spending by foreign students and tourists who aren't allowed into the country. But because a number of foreign students and perhaps even some foreign tourists have remained in the country since the borders were closed, they have still, over the 12 months to March, managed to spend almost $30 billion. That's a loss, as you can see, of about $30 billion compared with what they would have spent in the country if we'd still let them in. But the decline in spending by Australians abroad has been much greater. That's gone from over $50 billion a year to just $1 billion in the past 12 months. So in effect, the closure of Australia's borders has led to a significant increase in the surplus that Australia runs on travel transactions. That 50+ billion a year that Australians would have spent overseas if they'd been allowed to hasn't disappeared. Australia's incomes have been well supported by government policy measures and by the swift return of the jobs that were lost during the first 2 or 3 months of the crisis. So what would appear to be the case is that Australians who are denied the right to spend over $50 billion overseas, which they would have done if they'd been free to, have instead chosen to spend a very large proportion of that 50 billion or so a year in their homes, where they're spending more time on things like electronic and electrical goods, floor coverings, furniture and housewares, outside their homes, on their gardens, renovating their homes, once the stores were open, on clothing, footwear and personal accessories, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics and toiletries. Australians are spending a lot more on booze, it would seem, judging by the retail sales figures, and they're buying a lot more new cars as well, although they don't seem to be driving them as much, judging by what the figures tell us about petrol sales. In other words, the closure of Australia's borders has in effect deflected a very significant amount of spending, of the order of 1.25% of GDP per annum that would have been spent overseas, into the domestic economy. It's an additional form of stimulus to domestic spending on top of all the deficit spending that the government has been doing. What does this mean for economic policy?